it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Zed, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Zed.
Makes me act the way I do.
To UndeadLive, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, or night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or fully alive. We have the apocalypse covered. I'm Athena Aktipis.
And I'm Jason David Scott. And Athena, it's great to see you. You know, you've been on the run for several months.
Yes, I have been on the run. I'm trying to avoid a fate of becoming a zombie, but I'm not really sure.
Do we have any viral concerns? Any internal concerns?
I know that I'm not a infectious zombie.
Good.
But I think I might have gone through a period where I was zombified. I might still be. So I'll give you more updates on that when I figure it out a little bit more.
I've still managed to escape all of the viruses and signs of the apocalypse that have happened, but so glad to be here from Channel Zed's bunker today, broadcasting, because we're going to be talking about a recent series on HBO called Station 11, which gives us a glimpse into an apocalyptic future in a way that we've never quite seen before. So really excited to talk about that today. So before we start, let's show a little clip of the trailer from Station 11.
All that matters is the now and what got us to this point.
Stay with me, sir. Stay with me.
Where?
Where's your mom or dad?
I don't know.
I can't leave you here. I'll walk you to the L.
I think this thing is really happening. You can see it out there.
Can I have your attention, please? We have shelter. We have food. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened.
We're the traveling symphony. We travel for a reason. Just try to make the world make sense for a minute.
No one finds people from before.
Wow, right. I love this show. I am so excited about our guest today.
Yeah, because joining us today, Station 11 is based on a book, and joining us is the producer who saw the possibilities of bringing that book to the screen. So we're joined today by my good friend and an alumni of ASU, Scott Steindorff, veteran television and film producer. Scott, thank you so much for joining us here on Channel Zed today.
Well, thanks for having me. Love what you're doing here. And don't call me a veteran. It makes me sound old.
Okay. Well, but you are an accomplished producer. Your previous credits include things like Empire Falls on HBO, The Lincoln Lawyer with Matthew McConaughey. So you've got a reputation for turning literary material into really quality entertainment. So we're looking forward to hearing your perspective about that today. Tell us a little bit about how you came to the project of Station 11 and sort of what the process was of bringing it to the screen.
Well, I buy the rights to books for movies and TV. It's not all I do, but I have I have very few skills in life. I love to read, and that's my way into this business. So I read a lot, and I read Station 11, I want to say several months before the book came out. And it was one of those manuscripts I read in one sitting because I love theater and I love art. And I was so captivated by the characters in the world that Emily Mandel created here. And I read it in one sitting, and the next day I made a deal with the agent. I knew it was going to be a hit book. I knew I could make something out of it. And I was really enthusiastic about the material.
Awesome. I want to pull in a comment already from Diana Fleischman. She says that she's reassured that that a flu virus with no incubation period that kills so many people would be pretty unlikely to evolve naturally. So I think that, you know, as we're sort of thinking about, you know, what kind of, you know, what ways this show gives us some, you know, ways of thinking about the reality that we're all in right now with the pandemic, that there are at least some positive sides to thinking about that, you know, it's pretty unlikely evolutionarily that we'd have such a virus that was so deadly. So when you were making the show, how did that sort of issue of like just how fatal it was, how did that influence the way that you envisioned how the characters would sort of be existing together?
Well, the scripts were written and we started shooting. We shot 2.5 episodes before there was any pandemic. So it wasn't until I remember being on set in Chicago near the end of shooting in Chicago, and my assistant said, "There's a CNN truck here on set and they want to talk to you." And I thought, why would CNN be here? And they were there to talk about a pandemic that was just beginning. So we had already shot the first 2 episodes and some snippets of other episodes before the pandemic started.
Did you have a sense that there was a threat of a pandemic that maybe was being underappreciated, and that was part of why this story was compelling to you from the beginning, or is it really purely coincidence?
No, it was truly a coincidence. We never thought of it as a pandemic show. We always thought of it, this is a show about a group of artists that something disastrous happens and how they live and how we function. So we never kind of took that dystopian way into the show. So
yeah, it is really unique, right? In that it's not a dystopian view of a post-apocalyptic future, right? It's a situation where the apocalypse is not the end of the world.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Scott, because you said you started shooting before the pandemic, and I remember you being at ASU on the Friday before spring break. You guest lectured in one of our classes, and I asked you where you were going. You said, "Oh, I'm off to this project I'm working on about a global pandemic," and we both sort of chuckled about it, or I think at least I did. And then I never came back from spring break. How did the production and how did the people working on it, who'd already invested so much creatively, who already thought they kind of knew what the show meant, how did that inform the rest of the production process as the pandemic evolved?
Well, I remember texting the writer, Patrick Somerville and showrunner, and saying, "Oh, don't worry, Patrick, we'll be back in production in a couple of weeks," when the pandemic hit. So I was an optimist that it would be over a lot sooner than it's still not over. But, you know, we were shut down for a while. Our pandemic show was shut down by a pandemic, but we resumed shooting, you know, in January of this last year. So we were shut down for about 9 months. So it was challenging to shoot in a pandemic because of the new protocols and COVID, but we got through it. And it didn't, you know, people always ask, well, did it change your story or your scripts? Not at all. You know, it didn't change anything because Emily had already written this book. Patrick had already written the scripts. So we already knew what we were doing.
Scott, I just have to ask, did the irony of, you know, some of the characters in the first few episodes are like, oh, everything's gonna be right back to normal, when you were shooting those first few episodes and thinking things were about to get right back to normal?
Well, we didn't, you know, when we were shooting, there was no hint of the pandemic. It was January, or, you know, the end of December, January and February, and it didn't really start until March. So there was no, there was no pandemic. It wasn't, I think one case of COVID had hit Chicago, but nobody thought, oh, it's going to shut down the whole world at that time.
Yeah. So if we come back to this this idea that we need the arts during times of uncertainty and difficulty and community, where do you feel like that these messages from Station 11, what do they have to say about the current time that we are in right now, where lots of people are dealing with tremendous uncertainty and many years of challenges, though not on the sort of scale of trauma that we see in Station 11, but certainly for a lot of people, it's been a time of major uncertainty.
So what's the question? I mean, how does
yeah, and how does it? How does Station 11 have a message for us for how to potentially deal with this challenging time that we're all in?
Well, we pitched Station 11, and I think we kept to it. It's a show about joy. It's a show about art and joy. And it's about finding the joy and happiness in the simple things in life. During COVID, the streaming business has increased 5,000%. We're all watching art, movies, TV at home. Look at what's happened to art with NFTs and metaverses. And, it's the first time in the history of mankind that digital artists and artists can start making real substantial money with art in the history of civilization. So it has driven us, this pandemic, to art. So it's been a positive thing for art. We've had to, kids home from school are doing art projects. People are creating. People are I find that people are starting to become kinder and nicer to each other.
What's also fascinating about Station 11, and we've sort of hinted at this, is it's a post-apocalypse where, because there are so few people, resources are plenty, and there's no aliens to fight. There's still some concern that people might be sick, so you have some issues about strangers quarantining from each other a little bit. But this isn't, there are no zombies, there are no robots, there are no killer assassins from other countries trying to, take our gold or whatever. Instead, it's almost an antagonist-free show. There's certainly conflict in the show, but there's no bad guy that evolves. And instead, it becomes a story about how we tell the stories about the past and how we bring our memories of the past into the future, especially for that first generation of people who can remember the before time, because you also have a small group of characters who are born into the post-apocalyptic world. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you see not just art making, but storytelling and reclaiming our sort of storytelling history as part of the show.
Well, it's a show about storytelling. It's about a group of artists that are traveling in the traveling symphony and trying to keep art and humanity alive. And they're on a mission to share their artistic talent and their storytelling and how relevant it is in the future. And so then we have what's called the Museum of Civilization, which is taking simple things that we take for granted today that they don't have 20 years in the future, and remembering that. And then there's a whole group of kids that grew up not knowing anything about the before, and they're idolizing a comic book hero, Dr. 11. And it's almost like how religions begin. So it's all about epic storytelling. And that's what drew me to this material. It's just, and how, I don't want to scare people away. There's Shakespeare in it, but it's done in a way that is so unique and timely, like many of his plays were, and how important that is in humanity. So I think it's really. Go ahead.
There's a moment where, not giving any spoilers, but some people reenact the first scene of Hamlet,
Right.
which I've seen in production many times and I've read many times. I have never cried so much at the opening scene, because the context of that scene and the way it's played out is really remarkable. It also reminds me, there's a scholar named Diana Taylor who wrote a book called The Archive and the Repertoire, which is about performance in the Americas. And she talks about how there's two ways of memorializing art or in storytelling. One is the museum model, where we put the objects there and they're permanent and they're almost scientific in nature. And then there's the repertoire. That's all the performed stuff that can't be put into a museum, because you have to be there to experience it, to be a part of it. And you have, in these two sort of separate civilizations that meet each other in Station 11, that archive in the museum, and then the repertoire of the traveling performers. And a lot of the tension is, how do those two things learn how to live with each other in a future where dividing them seems silly, but they also look at how we engage with time and with our own memory in such a different way.
Yes. And that was, in her book, and it was really relevant to the story and how the characters react to these things and interact from their art and fascination with the world. And also the art of community, and how they all come together to try to tell stories since the beginning of mankind. So, this is very symbolic of what could happen and what is happening in a way. I mean, here all of us are talking about art on a Zoom or a video show. How fantastic is that we can keep going and finding creative ways to connect with each other, because it's a show about connection.
Yeah, Scott, how do we do that kind of as we go forward in this time now, where we do have these barriers between us to being in person in the way that we might all want to be? How do you create community when there are these kinds of challenges? Are there lessons for us from the characters and the story of Station 11 for how to create that community?
Well, I think it's important to connect with each other. And we're doing that with Zooms and calls and FaceTimes and video chats. And we're also doing it because we have more time. We're being more productive, a lot of us, with our time. We're writing, we're drawing, we're creating. It's been a very creative time for me as an artist to create new material and to connect with my deeper self. And that's what the show's about. It's about connecting with other people and keeping that. What is it about us being human beings and our creativity and our humanness and our emotions? It's a very emotional show, which is something that I've always driven with my courses at ASU about feeling. It's art evokes emotions and feelings. And it was important for us to create a lot of feelings in the show, and I think we accomplished that.
Scott, do you have any tips for us in terms of, having our own creative practices not be stymied by the challenges of the current pandemic, rather, having them encouraged? Or, how did you manage to have it be a time that was creative and productive for you?
Well, I was very busy making a TV show during the pandemic.
Absolutely, yeah. So you had an ongoing project that you were in.
But I turned, early on, I turned off CNN, I turned off politics, and I got at the desk and I started writing and creating. There's nothing I can do about the pandemic. I'm powerless over the pandemic. I'm powerless over the politics. I turned all that off and I focused on what do I want to do with my life? I want to write and create, and that's what I've been doing. And so
Let me ask.
it's go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you a question about putting the show together initially, and that's an ongoing thing when you're working on a series. But it's a very inclusive show, both on screen and off screen. And I wonder if you could just sort of speak to the values of inclusivity, not just from a creative standpoint, but also from a production standpoint.
Well, I think one of the greatest lessons I've learned as having done this for a while is that Hiro Murai, our director of the first couple episodes, and Patrick Somerville, and we all got together, and Hiro, and especially I think it was Hiro, said, I want to create an artist community. I want everybody involved in this project to be a real artist that's going to contribute. And Patrick also was that way. Let's create an artist community, and let's create characters that are diverse. Let's have people from, this is a international pandemic. Let's get people from South America. Let's get all sorts of different characters and put them into the potpourri of the show. And so it was a very deliberate act to make it very diverse as far as people working on the show and in the show, and all the artists involved. It was my favorite experience of anything I've ever done.
Well, you can really see that in the production detail too, how that you have this traveling symphony, and really there's only 2 or 3 important characters, but we almost get to know all of those people, even if they're just there for a moment or two or have a line or two. They're so specific, and they seem so invested in seeing themselves as part of that world, and knowing, not just Hiro Murai, but Jeremy Podeswa, Helen Shaver. These are really, really exceptionally well-respected television directors, which is not, that means they're not famous. It means they do their job brilliantly without showing off. So you had to put a really great team together.
Yeah, it was a great team of artists. And Jessica Rhodes, who also produced it with us, and Nate Madison and Dylan Russell, my part. Everybody came together, and just it wasn't about commerce or any. Let's create art, And I'm so happy to see that the critics have really responded to the artistic nature of this show, and Patrick's brilliant writing. I mean, he really created some spectacular things that were just ideas in the book, and he elaborated on them, and he went deep into the woods on these characters and gave them very full emotional lives. So many students are always looking at the big events and the big ideas, but it's making these characters human and relatable and emotional. And I remember Jeremy and Patrick and I, we were in the mixing stage on episodes 9 and 10. We had seen this show so many times, and 3 grown men crying at the end of it, in our final mix. So touched by the characters and the emotions they evoked and the art that was on screen. It just still breaks me up.
The mixing and the nonlinear storytelling, I thought, was just really spectacular as well. And the sort of, the metaphors also about nonlinearity with the, the idea of like solving logistics problems and there being nonlinear solutions. It just had such a nice, both the practicalities of how it was all mixed, and then the way that those elements were kind of also reflected in the story. To me, I was really struck by that and really impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the nonlinear storytelling, which Patrick, had worked on, The Leftovers and Maniac and other shows, that was it. I think you're going to see a lot more of this. It'll be interesting, Jason, with your students, but it's really an area to explore how this is exploding, that we don't live in a linear world, and the structure of our storytelling, we don't live our lives like that.
Yeah.
So it's very authentic.
Well, especially, I was going to say, especially now when although it's not as devastating as the pandemic in Station 11, what we're living through, I think we're now at the moment where we're trying to match the past and the future, to sort of say, what do we have from the past that we have to hang on to? What are we so afraid that we're losing that our children are not going to have? And how can we make sure that we preserve that? And so seeing that struggle activated in those characters is really, really resonant.
Well, it's like the theme of the show, survival is insufficient. What's important to our lives, and it's about connection. It's about it's like when Jeevan ends up not being a real doctor in a place where he's having to deliver babies, and I don't want to give too much of it away, but that episode is so beautiful to me. And it's finding meaning and purpose. It's finding meaning and purpose in our art and what our talents and capabilities are and how we can connect and give and contribute. And that's what the show's about. And that's what I think we're all learning through this pandemic. How can we give? How can we contribute? How can we be better humans? How can we get through this and not just be focused on making money and doing the things that we do, or our beliefs? I think a lot of beliefs were disrupted for all of us during this pandemic.
I think that's a really great point, that, for a lot of people, this pandemic has been an opportunity to think, well, what is it that I want to give to the world? Whether, it's you sitting down and deciding what you want to do is right and, get that out into the world, or people who work in healthcare just, pouring their heart and soul into their work, or, other areas where people have really made immense sacrifices. And, I think that oftentimes, especially in my field of cooperation theory, there's often an emphasis on, how can you get more for yourself? How can you cheat the system? But there is something very real about this part of human nature that really just wants to contribute in the way that you can to a community and be a valued part of a community. So seeing those themes in an apocalypse, story, I think is really, really important, because so many apocalypse stories focus on the negative side, the threats, the people who cheat and try to take advantage and exploit.
The assumption that we'll all descend into violence, the assumption that everything that we have about civilization will go away and we'll just be brutal, forced to live through brute force, when that probably is not the case.
Yeah,
it certainly isn't in our present day at this point.
And in a lot of disasters, what you see at the very beginning is people, often come together and really help one another. And it's kind of a myth that things, descend into chaos immediately. That's not really the reality.
Yeah. I know we've got some questions that I can't see on the screen over there, but
we have one here from E. Lee asking about how did you balance the trauma of loss in a post-pandemic world with this beauty of life? So this sort of, simultaneous trauma and challenge with this beauty.
Well, I think because there was so much trauma of how this story unfolds, that the characters go through so much pain and difficulty, but they have to survive and they have to keep going. And there was a humility about it. And so I think humility had a major play in this story of the characters. And I think this, I love this question, because it really goes for all of us, right? We've all experienced trauma. We've all had people in our lives that suffered or maybe even passed away from COVID, and all these difficulties of people losing jobs and businesses. It's been a horrendous experience for a lot of people. And for us to kind of come together, you know, we've been through this divided country politically and beliefs. And I feel like we're coming to the end of that. And people with different beliefs and political views and everything are starting to reach out and talk to each other. So I think there's beauty in the recovery. And I think that's what we were trying to capture in the show is there's beauty in the recovery. We're alive. We're okay. We can help each other.
Yes. So it really is a story of hope amidst the sort of aftermath of an apocalypse.
A joyful apocalyptic movie. Yeah, as you intended. So Scott, I know you're sort of still promoting Station 11. There's a lot of talk about award season, this season and next season. What's next for you? How are you keeping busy post Station 11 with new creative stuff?
Well, I'm doing a TV series based on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the real story, the real authentic story. I'm doing a project called The Psychology of Stupidity, which is about a real psychologist that treats stupidity, based on a best-selling French book. And I'm doing a project called Psychedelic City, which deals with the bending of consciousness, and not just about psychedelic drugs, but about consciousness. Kind of a group of people that are exploring that world. So both of that, all those shows deal with connection, and who knows what's next for the Station 11 universe, but more on that later.
We'll anxiously be watching, because even though the series definitely stands on its own, exploring those characters and exploring that world where, despite dire circumstances, people's focus is on telling stories and performing and sharing and making music and preserving Shakespeare. That's a world that we all hope that I think we could live in at some point. Yeah,
absolutely. Scott, do you have any last comments or words you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I'm just so happy to be part of the Arizona State University family. That's where a lot of it started for me, in the theater department many, many years ago, and business. And it's just been such an important part of my life, and such great people that are keeping art alive on this phone call. Thank you so much. Thank you for your contributions. Really grateful to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Athena, tell us what's coming up next week on Channel Zed.
Well, if you have the feeling that this pandemic just keeps going Omicron and on and on and on, so do we. And we will have a special episode with Dr. Zed and special guests, Jessica Brinkworth. And we will be talking about the pandemic also with Andrew Reed, who is a infectious disease expert as well. So if you're curious about what is in store for us with our current pandemic, Dr. Zed will be on to answer all of your questions. And so that is what we have in store.
Okay. And we won't be in the bunker next week, but we will be back in the bunker in future weeks with certain episodes. And we're excited to kick off this latest season of Channel Zed.
Yeah, well, and thank you all for joining us for this edition of Undead Live on Channel Zed. And remember, the best way to protect your brains in the apocalypse, zombie or otherwise, is to share them. Join us next time here on Undead Live, where we have the apocalypse covered.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.